In the last two lectures, we tested our application on the Xamarin Live Player. It's time for us to test it on an Android emulator in case you didn't install Visual Studio Preview or changed to the alpha channel of Visual Studio for Mac. Remember that right now the Xamarin Live Player is only available with these preview tools, while the Android and the iOS emulators are just available for anyone. So while we tested the application on the Xamarin Live Player, we did notice that the button was overlaying the entry and the entry was overlaying the label. So we added this stack layout, a container that will allow us to stack the elements inside of it. And we mentioned that we also needed to add these vertical options, so the stack layout was vertically centered inside of the page because the label was being rendered outside of the page. And so we were now able to see the label, the entry, and the button. And we were also able to test that the functionality is correct. But let's go ahead and test now on the Android simulator to learn exactly how we have to do that. On Visual Studio, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that the Android project is selected as the one that we are going to be testing. You will find this drop-down menu that will list the two projects that we have in the solution, the Android and the iOS project. Again, make sure that it is the Android project that you select, and you will see a list of emulators available for you to run the application. The list will vary if you're on Windows or if you're on Mac, but you will see at least one emulator ready for you to test on. In the case of Visual Studio on Windows, I suggest you select the one that says Phone and that says x86. This is going to be using the Intel Hardware Acceleration Manager that we mentioned we had to install when we run the installer, which is going to allow the emulator to launch much faster. On Mac, you will also have an x86 option. I also suggest you select that one. Once you have selected it, click on the Run button, and the first thing that will happen is that the emulator will launch. If you selected an x86 emulator, it shouldn't take long before you see a window like this one. All you have to do is click on OK for the emulator to launch, and you will see a window that you can resize to adapt to your screen that will start initializing Android. You will see that Android is starting up, and once Android is ready, Visual Studio will launch the application. And if you test it with the Xamarin Live Player on an iOS device, you will notice that this looks a little bit different. Because, like we said, this adapts to the operating system that the application is being launched to. So we see native controls on iOS and native controls on Android. In this case, we can see it more obviously on the button, which on iOS was just a blue text. But we do have the same elements. We have the Welcome to Xamarin Forms label, we have the entry, and we have the button. And the entry will allow us to write down something inside of it, for example, my name. And I can click on the button and the functionality is exactly the same. So we are certain now that the functionality works the exact same way on iOS and on Android, without us only having to code this once and design it once. So as you can see, testing on an Android simulator is very easy. Once you have tested, you can head back to Visual Studio and stop the debugging with this stop icon. And this is how you may want to test your Android applications. If you have Xamarin Live Player, you can also test with an Android device, but remember that most of the times we're going to be using PCL instead of shared project, in which case we will need the emulator because it won't yet work with the Xamarin Live Player. But you also have to keep in mind that testing on an Android simulator is not the only thing that you should do. Especially when you're closing up into releasing the application to the App Store, you should definitely consider testing your application on a device. But for most of the tests that we will be doing throughout the course, it will be just fine to test on an Android emulator. But keep in mind that if you really want to test your applications, you should consider at least borrowing an Android and an iOS device, in case you do not have one of those, to test your application before releasing to the store. Now that we have learned how easy it is to test our Android application on an Android emulator, in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at how to do this on iOS. And this will require a couple of additional steps because remember that to be able to do this, we do need a Mac connected to the same network.